A year ago, famine was the issue in Ethiopia that troubled governments and people in the United States and the Western world. Now the issue is resettlement. A group of French doctors charged yesterday that the Ethiopian government has killed an estimated 100,000 of its own people by its program of forced resettlement. The group, Doctors Without Borders, said the U.S. and other Western countries should stop food aid unless Ethiopia modifies the resettlement program. We examine this tonight with one of the French doctors, an Ethiopian official, and the head of the U.S. aid program. But first, some background from a report by Brian Stewart of the CBC.
Resettlement began at the height of the famine panic last December. CBC News pictures of the first pathetic refugees being crammed into the bellies of Soviet planes were the only ones taken of a movement shrouded in mystery. Since then, refugees have been moved out of the famine-hit areas of Tigray, Wollo, and northern Shoa province down to the southwest. Total so far, 600,000. The goal, 1 million. Many Western governments and aid agencies remain highly skeptical of such a movement. Getting in to check on the new settlers is not easy. To visit hamlets near Gambela, we had to drive for hours through near trackless jungle and elephant grass. Some critics charge resettlement is really coercion, designed to weaken separatist movements in the north, a charge Ethiopia denies. Other criticisms are easier to check. New hamlets do seem rudimentary and hastily planned. Families have been separated, and many northerners do have trouble coping with the steaming humidity. There's also much malaria, which nearly killed this child, and few medical resources. But long-suffering northerners are also astonished by the fertility of soil here. Many seem genuinely determined to stay.
The new charges concerning the resettlement tragedies have come from a group of French physicians who work for an organization that until recently provided medical care to famine victims in Ethiopia. The group's president is Dr. Roni Brahman. Doctor, 100,000 people, you folks claim, have been killed by this resettlement program?
At least, in fact. We think that more than 100,000 people have perished during the journey from the north to the south and during the first 3 months of the resettlement. But to figure out the whole thing, you have to practically see what the different steps are. First, the people are recruited. I should rather say captured. Thanks to debates made by the foreign aid, people are attracted by this foreign aid, come to the relief camps, or are just captured in their own villages where the crop is still standing in its field now.
Captured by whom? Government troops?
By government troops, our militiamen. First, they are captured or blackmailed, thanks again to the relief goods. For instance, the militiamen or the party members would say, now you go to the resettlement, or you won't get any food and any blanket. And in this season, you know, in this highland, to not get food and blankets means death, because it is very cold. The water is freezing at night time, just to figure out what the temperature is. Once they have been captured, they are taken to holding centers where they stay about from 3 days to 3 weeks. The conditions of those holding centers would not be even acceptable, I would say, for animals. People are crammed up by thousands and thousands without adequate water supply.
Crammed up in what? In pens?
Sort of
and what?
Holding centers just with a roof and nothing else. They are guarded by our militiamen. There are food standing there, but it is used, as it is shown in several reports, only by the soldiers, not for the good of the people. There is no adequate water supply. The food is withheld to weaken the people so as they cannot escape, because they have only one idea in mind, is to escape. These people who are very weak because they have suffered terrible periods, they are still very fragile. Their natural defense system has broken down because they have been through a terrible period. They have no proteins to defend themselves. There is a terrible outbreak of epidemics such as shigellosis, which is bloody diarrhea, which kills when it is not properly treated, as typhus, which is endemic throughout the country, as respiratory diseases. And we estimate, and according to the UN report we've got here, and I can show it to you, the death mortality only in those holding centers is about 15%, which means that out of 100 people who are taken to those holding centers, 15 die.
They never leave the holding center?
Those one will never leave the holding center. Then people are taken down to the resettlement areas. And as the film has shown, no adequate water supply, no preparation, no dwelling, no food is prepared to receive them. And again, during the first 3 months of this relocation, the death toll are incredibly high. And a report made by Cultural Survival, a group of Boston-based anthropologists, has shown that the death toll only in those countries only in those areas had been of 100,000.
Is it your position that those people would not have died had they not been involved in the resettlement program?
Just to make a point, in this UN report, the registration books of the Ethiopian government show that out of 10,000 people, on average, every day, 23 die in those resettlement settlements during over a period of several months. In the relief camp, at the same time, for the same range of people, only 2 died, which means that the death toll is 10 times as high.
Do you agree with the charge that this is being done for political purposes?
It's difficult for me to take such a stance. I don't know exactly what for it is made. The only thing I can say is that it is carried out thanks to the relief good, and it is done against the will of the people, and that it is a deadly operation.
And you want the United States government and the other Western nations, or other nations, period, who are putting aid money and aid supplies in there to stop it, correct?
Let's make it clear. The resettlement has become the #1 cause of mortality in Ethiopia. In other terms, the drought, the famine doesn't kill as much as the resettlement. In fact, the resettlement kills much more than the drought. And it is carried out through the relief goods. So what we ask, we want just to stop the arm of the executioner. If the people die, we can prevent them from dying by just suspending this resettlement operation and by sending a fact-finding mission. We want things to be clear. We want the aid to be transparent. So we would like to have an investigation commission on the field to establish the whole thing.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Robin?
To answer these charges, we have Ethiopia's ambassador to the United Nations, Bernahu Dinka. Mr. Ambassador, how do you respond to the general charge that resettlement is killing more Ethiopians than the famine?
Well, to start with, the allegations I've heard so far that it's forced to, that people are being denied food when they're in transitory camps, and third, that it causes death, is an absolute and total lie. And I'll tell you why. People are not forced. In fact, the Ethiopian government has made it absolutely clear that only the voluntary people would go to these settlements. Number two, that only the physically able-bodied people will go, the healthy ones. And as the Sunday Times, I believe of, not Sunday Times, but the Spectator of London on May 25, 1985, had written, the problem that in fact the Ethiopian government is now facing is not forcing people to go, but keeping back those who want to go.
So you're denying that you say the resettlement is voluntary, there's no coercion,
there's
not armed soldiers forcing these people to go, capturing them. You're saying that only the physically able go. What about dying in the transit camps?
No, there is...
At a faster rate, he said, than they were dying in the relief centers.
This was answered. You see, I don't even want to use my own words. I want to tell you what other people have said, because it would be perhaps more credible, because you may consider me as an official representative of the government, therefore my word against his word. I would like to tell you that the UN coordinator, United Nations coordinator for relief in Ethiopia, who is representing the Secretary General of the United Nations and coordinates all aid that has been donated, has said that there is no such a thing, that the Doctors Without Borders are saying is all political, and you can see why it is political.
Why would the doctors be saying that? What would their political motive be for saying that?
They were in Ethiopia for 18 months before they were expelled.
They have been expelled.
They have been expelled from last month.
Why were they expelled?
Now, I'll come to that. They were in Ethiopia for 18 months. They never said anything until last October, when they were discovered trying to get some money from the EEC, which has been already earmarked for purchases of seed for Ethiopia. They wanted to get 700,000 of that for themselves.
From the European community.
From the European community, without even consulting with the Ethiopian government. Then the Ethiopian government intervenes and stops this payment or transfer to Doctors Without Borders. And from then on, Dr. Brauman started a personal kind of vendetta, in spite of the fact that the umbrella association, which is called the Christian Relief and Development Association, to which Doctors Without Frontiers belonged when they were serving in Ethiopia, has dissociated itself from their campaigns by saying that they are disseminating falsehoods and that they are politically motivated.
Finally, what is the purpose of resettlement?
The purpose of resettlement, this is not a new thing now. The resettlement process has been going on since 1973 on the basis of a study made by the World Bank in 1973 under a man by the name of Dr. Brown. And then the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, had made a land use study for such resettlements and selected these sites. Now, in 1974, when the emperor was in power, the United States government and the Peace Corps actually started resettling people in those areas. Then the revolution came and the Peace Corps left and the whole thing stopped. Now, in 1979, the new government started this resettlement process, but slowly. But last year and the year before, when the drought became very intense and famine situation was very bad, they started moving people at an accelerated pace to these new areas. And
to move them out of infertile areas, drought areas, to areas where they can grow crops.
Of totally infertile areas, which need perhaps decades to be resuscitated and cannot at all support life anymore.
Dr. Brauman, how do you answer the charge that this is just a vendetta by you after you were unable to get the diversion of aid from the EEC that the Ethiopian government objected to?
Oh, I would say many things. I would say first that we did not get this aid diverted because we got the money from the European community, and this is absolutely ridiculous to say so. We have protested against unacceptable abuses of human rights and the misappropriation of the aid, and this was the point. I will just briefly recall a few things about those theoretical conditions Mr. Ambassador recalled. Effectively, the Ethiopian government has accepted that the people, the new settlers, should volunteer to go to the new settlement. They should be in good physical condition, and there should not be any family separation. That was the three conditions accepted by everybody. They are very good conditions, and we would love to see those conditions respected.
But you say they are not met, those conditions.
But they are massively violated. I would say that almost 100% of the population who has been resettled by force. And this has been denounced by the International Committee of the Red Cross, by Oxfam, who has recently denounced the forced migration.
Let me go back to the ambassador on that. That is a direct contradiction of what you said. He says the theory is fine, but in practice you are coercing and forcing these resettlements.
That's absolutely not true. Again, I would quote an NGO, a non-governmental organization, which is working in Ethiopia for a long time and which happens to be #1 in size and contribution, and that is the World Vision of the United States. We have 47 NGOs in Ethiopia, and the Doctors Without Frontiers is the smallest and the noisiest. They have 150,000 operational budget. 3 doctors at the peak of their activities in Ethiopia. Now, World Vision, which has covered more areas than they could ever dream to do, says through its own vice president, Mr. Cliff Benzel, he says people are moving voluntarily, #1. And the government is moving whole families. Now, this is the Times of London on January 22nd, 1985.
Okay.
I think what Dr. Brauman should answer is, why did they wait, the Doctors Without Borders, until October when he started his campaign against him?
All right, we'll give him an opportunity, but we want to move the discussion on. Jim?
Yes, listening to this exchange with the rest of us has been M. Peter McPherson, the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is responsible for dispensing U.S. aid to Ethiopia. Mr. McPherson, who's telling the truth here?
I think the doctor is far closer. We've been condemning this forced program for over a year. Our worst fears are coming about. The facts are, report after report show that people are forced. My own aid people in Ethiopia have come upon a camp, for example, where people holding guns are keeping people there. We know that...
I mean, that's not hearsay.
That's not hearsay. We know it. And it's almost sad to see this ambassador talk about how people want to go to these camps. We know from refugees, escapees, streaming across the borders into Sudan, that say, we were taken. We know that people are being forced here. And I don't know all the story about this group, but I do know that a lot of people tell me they were kicked out of Ethiopia because they complained about the situation.
What about how are your aid people being treated when they complain?
Well, we're certainly the loudest agency in the world saying that things are wrong in Ethiopia again and again. I suppose it doesn't help us any, but we think the world needs to know.
What about the doctor's statement that people are dying in these resettlement camps faster than they were dying from the famine itself?
We know that at least in some camps, the camps my people visited a few weeks ago.
Now here again, these are U.S. aid officials have gone to these camps. Okay.
Precisely.
All right.
We know that at least in those camps we visited, at the time we were there, that our professional calculations were that the rate of death was as high as the worst time of the famine in the stricken areas last year. That doesn't say it's all over, but I think it's pretty clear this situation is a very bad situation indeed.
I asked Dr. Brownman, and he said he wasn't qualified to answer. Let me ask you, do you believe that there's a political motivation behind this, or what is the evidence on that?
Well, from the very beginning, as we've talked about several times on this program, the U.S. has had a moral dilemma. On one hand, it seemed like the maintenance of power, the ideology of the Ethiopian government often predominated against their desire to save the lives of their own people. And as we've tried to get things done, it's been a continual problem. I think that what needs to be done by the world community is basically what the U.S. did last year. We need to insist that our food not go through the Ethiopian government. We can't trust donor food going through the Ethiopian government. It's got to do, as we did last year, largely through private voluntary organizations like CARE and Catholic Relief and others.
But not do what Dr. Brownman suggests, which is to withdraw aid altogether.
Well, see, there's millions of people in the country that need food, we think, to exist this next year. Millions of people outside those camps. There are about 600,000 people in those camps, these resettlement camps. We think that we have a moral responsibility to feed those people outside those camps, but to make sure that that food goes not through the government, but directly to the people. That is a difficult weighing, but in our judgment, that's the way to save the most lives. And I honestly believe that if the donor community will get together and do what we did last year, and we were the only donor that really insisted that this be done, as a doctor has told me several times, this is what we've insisted upon. If the donor community will insist upon that, I think we'll get the Ethiopian government to back off this forced program.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Ambassador? Would you stop the resettlement program if the U.S. did that?
No, everybody.
Everybody? Would the U.S. got everybody to do it with them?
Let me say this to you, but I hope I'll be able to answer what Mr. McPherson said. First of all, people like Mother Teresa and UN organizations all support the resettlement program. Mother Teresa went and visited these places where people are resettling, and she gave it her total support and blessing. And I don't think anybody can accuse Mother Teresa of being a flaming radical. Now, to go back to your question, that would the Ethiopian government stop if everybody gangs up and says, don't do it, I'll tell you something. It's in our national character that we'll never do anything against our will, no matter what the odds. This is number one.
All right, so that won't work. All right, what about what about Mr. McPherson's earlier charge that his people have seen? Now let's be specific. He said,
Poway. The camp was Poway.
This is what I would like to take up. Mr. McPherson gave a press conference about 2 weeks ago in Washington, and he talked about Poway. And I am going to tell him exactly what had happened. Poway is a village today of 96,000 inhabitants. 2 young functionaries in their early 20s went from the U.S. Embassy to visit these areas. They went and stayed for 4 hours in a village of 96,000. And they came back after 4 hours and reported to their embassy all sorts of stories.
And those stories were not true? Is that your point?
That's right. Because after this report, Mr. Priestley, who is now the new coordinator of the United Nations in Ethiopia, sent the health director of UNICEF and the health director of the emergency operations of United Nations in Ethiopia, together with World Food Program representatives, to check out this report. They came back and they reported, A, that there are resource limitations, which is absolutely correct. We don't deny this.
You mean not enough food, not enough water, not enough medicine?
Not that we don't have, for instance, enough money to build roads, better roads to
But what about his complaint? What about his, excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, let's be specific.
Yes.
What about his charge that there were people holding guns on these people and not letting them go?
I was going to that.
Okay.
Now, they said that there are resource limitations, correct. There is no force. And then they said the American report has been tremendously exaggerated. And they said, which is very, very important, because the American report was based on the absence of health facilities for these people. The report of these UN people, after the American report, said that, contrary to the American report, medical services in Poway is 3 times the national average.
All right, let's ask
and that's not my word.
Mr. McPherson?
All I can say is there were people there with guns, that crowds gathered around our people and shouted that they want to go, made it very clear they didn't have enough food, talked about the people that were dying. The facts are the UN isn't supporting resettlement, as the ambassador suggests. The UN has grave doubts about the speed and about all that's happening. There's a question of dimensions, I suppose, as to how many people are dying, as how bad it is. We can debate that. But, Mr. Ambassador, the situation is very bad indeed, and Ethiopia doesn't have the credibility in the world community to stand up and say the kinds of things you're saying. The facts are we've spent a year trying to get you to do what's necessary in your country. We have another terrible year ahead of us. Please help us.
Mr. Ambassador?
Mr. McPherson, first of all, I would like to say that the UN supports it. And I have a copy of a resolution from the United Nations General Assembly, which was passed last year and this year at the 40th session. And I will give it to our colleague here to read the 6th operative paragraph, which requests the Secretary General to mobilize international resources for assistance to Ethiopia, including for resettlement. This is number 1. This is the support of the United Nations, which we have. Number 2, on Tuesday, October 29, 1985,
Mr. Ambassador, I'm sorry. We have to leave it there.
Just one second. Oh. Mr. Kurt Jansen has given the Guardian of London exactly the fact that the UN supports this, and he appealed to support resettlement in Ethiopia to all governments.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us in New York, and gentlemen, thank you here. Mr. McPherson.